Hey guys, tonight we're going to sit with a winter you already know. The blizzards, the twisted hay, the coffee mill on the kitchen table, turning all day for one loaf of bread. A little town on the Dakota Prairie, cut off from the world for most of 5 months. You've heard this one. You've probably heard it here. But there's a number in it that never gets said out loud. Everybody remembers 6 people in that house. There were 9. Let me give you the 3 the book leaves out, because I don't want to make you wait for them. A young man named George Masters, his wife Maggie, and their son, Arthur, who was born in an upstairs room of an Ingalls building on the 23rd of May, 1880, with Caroline Ingalls and a neighbor woman named Mrs. Garland, doing what women did for one another out there when there was no doctor and no time to send for one. Arthur was about 5 months old when the first blizzard came down in October. He was about a year old when the trains finally got through in May. He spent the whole of the hard winter inside that building, in the same rooms as Laura, in the same cold, breathing the same close air over the same small stove. And when Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down almost 60 years later to write the book we call The Long Winter, she took all 3 of them out. Not softened, not renamed, removed. If these long, quiet histories help you rest, you can subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what happens here at night. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what the clock says on your side of the world. Our 3 little books live at prairiesecrets.com. If you're watching on a television, the code on your screen will take you straight there. On a phone, the links are sitting in the description and the pinned comment. And if you drift off somewhere in the middle of this, good, that's what it's for. I'll keep watch. Now, here's the thing that makes this more than a piece of trivia. Laura didn't forget them. She remembered them with a precision that lasted 6 decades. When she was working on that manuscript in the late 1930s, in her 70s, in Missouri, sending letters back and forth with her daughter Rose about how to build the story, she put down a sentence about George Masters that has the temperature of a woman describing something that happened last Tuesday. He never went with Pa for a load of hay, she wrote. He never twisted any. He just sat. That is the voice of somebody who was 13 years old and cold and hungry, and who watched a grown man of 27 warm himself at a fire he did not feed, and who was still angry about it at 70. She wrote something else about them too, and this one is harder to read. We had not asked or wanted them to stay with us, she wrote, but they were out of money and had nowhere to go, so they just stayed on. And then, plainly, the line that tells you what that winter actually did to the people inside it. Times like this test people, she wrote, and we were getting to know George and Maggie. So that's the promise for tonight, and I'll put it in one sentence so you know exactly what you're getting. There were 9 people in that building through the hard winter. 3 of them were erased from the most famous survival story in American children's literature, and the reason Laura cut them is written in her own hand. We're going to find out who they were. We're going to find out why they were there and why they couldn't leave. We're going to find out what the town of Smet was actually doing that winter, which is not at all what the book tells you, and which is going to change the whole shape of the story about halfway through tonight. And at the end we're going to look at something Laura believed about Maggie Masters for 60 years, and at 2 dates in a county record that say she was wrong about it. Let's go back. Smet, Dakota Territory, spring of 1880. The town is 4 months old. It exists because a railroad needed a stop, and for no other reason at all. The Chicago and Northwestern was pushing west toward the Missouri River, and a railroad running west needs places to take on water and drop off freight and sell lots to the people who follow the rails, and Smet was one of those places. Kingsbury County has just over 1,100 people in it that year. 690 of them are men, and 412 are women. That ratio tells you everything about what kind of place it was. It was a work camp with a post office. On the 3rd of April 1880, the Ingalls family walks out of the Surveyor's house and moves into town. You should know what the Surveyor's house was, because it's the first piece of the money story, and it sets the pattern for everything after. Charles Ingalls had come out to Dakota Territory in June of 1879, hired by the railroad as a timekeeper and paymaster on the line running from Brookings west. Caroline and the 4 girls followed by train in the first week of September. And in December of 1879, the railroad made him an offer. They would let the family live in the Surveyor's house through the winter if he would look after the building and the tools stored in the lean-to. Read that as an employer would read it. A man is being paid in shelter, not in wages, in a roof. That is not a criticism of Charles Ingalls. It was a good arrangement in a country where a house in December was worth more than money, and he took it because it was the right thing to take. But if you want to understand why a certain kitchen was so much closer to the edge than the kitchens on either side of it 14 months later, start here, with a man whose compensation that winter was a place to stand. So, the 3rd of April 1880, they moved to town. Charles Ingalls has a lot. Block 4, Lot 21, on the main street. What he does not yet have is a building on it. So he builds one. 2 stories, frame construction, with a false front, which was the way a wooden box on a Prairie street was made to look like a solid establishment from the other side of the road. It is finished on the 20th of July, 1880. Downstairs there is a front room and a back kitchen, with a chimney running up between them, so that one fire can be worked from both sides. Upstairs, under the roof, there are rooms. Hold on to that plan, because it is the whole world for 5 months, and we're going to be counting bodies into it. Front room, back kitchen, 1 chimney, stairs, rooms above. And notice what Charles Ingalls did not build. He did not build a house. He built a store. That distinction is going to matter enormously, so let me put it down now and come back to it. A man who puts up a 2-story commercial building on the main street of a 4-month-old railroad town is a man making a bet. He is betting that the town will grow, that lots will rise, that a front room on the main street will be worth having. He is putting his labor and his lumber into the future of a place that has existed since January. He used the front room as his justice of the peace office and heard cases in it. And it was not only his. That building served as the county meeting hall. It served as the polling place, which means the men of Kingsbury County voted in the Ingalls family's front room. The first town school meeting in Smet was held there on the 13th of July, 1880. The first religious service in the town had been held in a building of his that February. So for 2 or 3 years before the town had a courthouse or a church or a school worth the name, the civic life of Smet happened on one side of a chimney, while a family of 6 lived on the other side of it. That is what a new town is. It is not a place with institutions. It is a place where somebody's front room is the institutions, until there is money for something better. Remember that, because in about 4 months' time that same front room is going to go cold, and the entire household is going to move to the kitchen side of the chimney, and the civic life of Kingsbury County is going to have to wait for spring. And into it, sometime that spring, comes a young woman named Margaret Masters, who is pregnant and who has nowhere better to be. Her husband, George, is out on the line. He is working for the company store of Halls, Harrison and Shute, the railroad contractors, and the work has taken him west toward Pierre. A construction camp is no place to have a baby, so an arrangement gets made, the way arrangements got made out there. Maggie will board with the Ingalls family in town, where there are women, and a stove, and a roof that stays where you left it. She's not a stranger. That's the part that gets lost the moment somebody uses the word boarder. The Masters family was already woven all the way through Laura Ingalls' life, and had been for years, in 3 states. Start with Samuel Masters. He was Laura's schoolteacher in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Not a name out of a footnote, her teacher. He had come out of Steuben County, New York, and he had a brother named William, and it was William who bought the Burr Oak House in Iowa in 1873 and turned it into the Masters Hotel. Now watch how the pieces fit together. In the autumn of 1876, after the grasshoppers had taken 3 crops in a row in Minnesota, and after the Ingalls family had buried a baby son on the road east, Charles Ingalls took work helping to run a hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa. That hotel was the Masters Hotel. Now, the ownership of that building matters because it is the sort of detail that gets garbled and then repeated forever. William Masters bought the Burr Oak house in 1873. He sold it in October of 1876 to a man named William Stedman, who kept it for only 7 months and sold it on in May of 1877. So when Charles Ingalls arrived in Burr Oak that autumn, he was working for Stedman, not for a Masters. The Masters family had already got out. But the name was on the building. The family was in the town. And here is the part that would have stayed with a 9-year-old girl. Laura wrote, later, that Stedman somehow cheated Pa out of his share of the hotel profits. That is the season that ends with a family walking their horses out of an Iowa town in the dark to avoid a landlord, and it happened in a hotel that a Masters had owned until about 10 weeks before they got there. The two families kept crossing each other's tracks across a decade and half a continent, in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa and Dakota, and in almost every crossing, the Ingalls family was the one arriving with less. And then there's Genevieve. Genevieve Masters was Samuel's daughter, which makes her George's younger sister. She followed the Ingalls family from Walnut Grove to Smet, and she is one of the 3 real girls that Laura later melted together to make Nellie Oleson, the teacher's daughter, the one with the Eastern clothes and the Eastern manners, in a town built out of raw pine. So when we say the Masters family got written out of the Little House books, understand the size of the thing we're describing. It isn't a house guest. It is Laura's schoolteacher. It is her schoolteacher's brother, who owned the hotel her father worked in during the worst year the family ever had. It is her schoolteacher's daughter, who became the most famous adversary in the whole series. And it is her schoolteacher's son, who lived in her house through the worst winter of her life. Not one of them appears under their own name in any of the 8 books. Genevieve was dissolved into a character. The rest got nothing. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of fact that gets used badly. Nobody is accusing Laura Ingalls Wilder of dishonesty. She was writing novels. Novels compress. Every writer who has ever turned a life into a story has left somebody standing just outside the frame, and most of them had better reasons than we will ever know about. But the surviving evidence gives us a more complicated picture than the one on the page, and the more complicated picture is the better story. So let's go and get it. Back to the spring. On the 23rd of May, 1880, Maggie Masters gives birth to a son in an upstairs room of an Ingalls building in Smet. They name him Arthur Kingsbury Masters. The middle name is almost certainly for Kingsbury County. People did that. You named a child after the piece of ground you had decided to stake your life on, the way other people name children after saints, and it meant the same thing. This is where we are staying. There is no doctor. Caroline Ingalls is there. So is a woman named Mrs. Garland, whose family the town knew well, and whose son Cap is going to matter a great deal to this story before the winter is out. 2 women, 1 lamp, 1 bed, 1 first child. That was the standard of care available to a young wife in a railroad town on the Dakota Prairie in 1880. And by the standards of the place and the year, Maggie Masters was lucky. Here is a small thing about that date that I did not expect to find, and that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. 3 years earlier, on the 23rd of May 1877, in a rented house in a wooded part of Burr Oak, Iowa, Caroline Ingalls had given birth to her own last child. That was Grace. The same day of the same month. Caroline's last baby and Maggie's first, 3 years apart, and Caroline in the room for both of them. I don't want to make more of that than a calendar can bear. It is a coincidence. But it is the kind of coincidence that tells you something about how narrow these lives were, and how few rooms there were, and how the same handful of women kept turning up at the same handful of beds. Now, a note on the geography of that birth, because I would rather tell you what we do not know than let you carry a picture that might be wrong. Charles Ingalls did not finish the store building on Lot 21 until the 20th of July. Arthur was born on the 23rd of May, so the upstairs room where he came into the world was almost certainly in an earlier town building the family had moved into that spring, and not the one they wintered in. Laura wrote that the Masters' baby was born at the Ingalls home. Exactly where the Ingalls home stood in May of 1880 is the part the records leave a little soft, and I'm going to leave it soft. What is not soft at all is the census. In June of 1880, a federal enumerator walks the streets of Smet with a ledger and a pen, and he writes the Masters family down as living with the Ingalls family in town. That is a government clerk, on a June morning, recording a household. It is not a memory. It is not a novel. It is a count. And here is what I keep coming back to. The Long Winter is a book about 6 people in a kitchen. It is one of the great enclosed stories in American writing, and almost all of its power comes from the smallness of the circle. 6 people, 1 stove, 1 sack of seed wheat in the wall, the world reduced to the space that a lamp can light and a voice can cross. The census had already written down a different number 11 years before Laura published a word. Summer moves on. On the 21st of July 1880, one day after Charles Ingalls finished his store building, George Masters files a homestead claim of his own near Smet. That's a young man doing exactly what a young man was supposed to do out there. Get the land, live on it, prove it up, build something for the boy. He is 27 years old. He was born in 1853 in Hornby, Steuben County, New York, the eldest child of Samuel Masters and Margaret Farrington. And he had married Margaret Gilmore in July of 1879 at Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Hold that date, July of 1879. We are going to need it much later, and when we get there, it is going to change how you hear one of the saddest sentences in this whole story. So by late summer of 1880, the shape of the thing is set. George has a claim and a job on the railroad. Maggie has a baby and a place to stay. The Ingalls family has a new building with a front room, a back kitchen, 1 chimney, and rooms upstairs. Everybody's arrangement is a summer arrangement, made by people who assume that autumn will arrive in autumn. Then the 15th of October happens. A low-pressure system stalls over northwest Iowa and northeast Nebraska, and for 2.5 days it throws snow across eastern Dakota. It starts on a Friday with thunder and lightning, which is not a thing that October snowstorms normally do, and it runs through Saturday at midnight. The Canton Advocate called it a terrible snowstorm, probably the worst that southern Dakota ever witnessed. Telegraph wires down, railroads blockaded. Drifts in the railway cuts, the paper said, from 15 to 25 feet. That is a newspaper in a different town, written in the plain language of a man who has been outside. And it is worth stopping on the date, because the date is the whole disaster. The middle of October. In that country, that is before the harvest is properly in. It is before anybody has laid in a winter's coal, because you buy coal when you have money from the crop, and the crop has not been sold. It is before anybody has finished a winter's anything. That storm did not arrive early. It arrived instead of autumn. The Ingalls family had spent the warm months out on the homestead claim, the way homesteaders did, holding the land by living on it. After that storm, Charles Ingalls moved his family into town, into the store building on Lot 21, because a frame claim shanty on open prairie is not something you argue with a Dakota winter about. The 1880 census had already found them in town rather than on the claim, and the town is where they stayed. And the Masters family, who had been expected to go, did not go. Laura wrote about this later, and her account of the sequence is careful. When fall came, George rejoined his wife and son. The Ingalls expected the 3 of them to move on. George delayed. Then the blizzards came, and then the train stopped, and after that there was nowhere for anybody to go at all. That is how it happened. Not a decision. A delay that hardened into a fact, in the way that a great many of the worst situations in history have arrived, without anybody choosing them. 9 people, 1 building, 5 months. Let's count them properly, because the arithmetic of that room is the engine of everything that follows tonight. Charles Ingalls, 44 years old. Carpenter, farmer, justice of the peace, and the only adult man in the household who is going to do the outside work. Caroline Ingalls, 40. The one who has to make whatever comes through the door feed everybody standing behind it. Mary, 15. Blind since the summer of 1879, which means she has now been living in the dark for about 16 months, and is about to spend a winter in rooms where the lamps will be turned low anyway to save what is in them. Laura, 13. Carrie, 10. Frail, and everybody in that family knows it and has known it since Kansas. Grace, 3. George Masters, 27. Maggie Masters, whose exact age we honestly do not know, and I would rather say that than invent a number for a woman who cannot correct me. And Arthur, 5 months old. 9. 6 of them children or teenagers, one of them blind, one of them a toddler who cannot be reasoned with about the cold, one of them an infant who cannot be left cold for a single hour without consequences, 2 women to run all of it. Now, before the snow really starts, I want to put one more piece of the town in front of you, because in about half an hour, I'm going to ask you to compare that kitchen to the kitchens on either side of it, and you'll need to know that there were kitchens on either side of it. De Smet in the winter of 1880 was not an outpost with one lit window. Roughly 30 households wintered in De Smet Township that year, and we know a great many of their names, because in a small town, everybody's name ends up in the same handful of records. The Ingalls family: Robert Boast and his wife, Charles Tinkham, Alfred Waters, Daniel Loftus, who kept a store, John Carroll, who would later put up a brick bank on the lot next to the Ingalls building, Amos Whiting, the county school superintendent, Edward Couse, hardware, the Reverend Brown, Charles Ely, Alfred Thomas, Henry Hinds, Charles Dawley, Martin Brislin, George Peerlett, Will Warner, Paul Cooper, George Wilmarth, Romanzo Bunn, Charles Lamson, Jake Hopp, Edelbert Hawthorne, the Fuller brothers, who kept the hardware, Margaret Garland and her family, including her son Cap, Almanzo Wilder and his older brother Royal, who had a feed store, and George Masters, listed in the records of that township as a household head in his own right, which is a small administrative fact with a lot inside it. On paper, that winter, George Masters had a household. In practice, his household was upstairs in somebody else's building, and the somebody else was going to have to feed it. 30 households, all of them under the same sky, all of them looking at the same railroad that had stopped coming. Keep them in mind. Around the middle of tonight, every single one of them is going to matter. The winter of 1880 and 1881 was not a story people told to make themselves sound brave. It was a genuine event, and we can measure it now in a way that nobody standing in it could measure it then. There is an index that climatologists use called the North Atlantic Oscillation. It tracks a pressure pattern that decides, in a very broad way, where the cold air in the northern half of the world ends up in any given season. When the number goes deeply negative, the cold comes south, and then it stays south. For December through March of that winter, the average sat at -3.8. That ties for the 5th lowest reading since 1864. January of 1881 came in at -5.9. That is the lowest single month on the entire record, not the lowest of that decade, the lowest there has ever been. And October of 1880 had already been the lowest October on record, which is exactly why a storm like that arrived while the corn was still standing in the field. Here is the number that turns all of that back into a house with people in it. Across January and February, out of 59 days, there were 12 on which no snow was probably falling anywhere in that region. 12 days out of 59. On the other 47, snow was coming down somewhere on that country. That is not a season with storms in it. That is a season made of storms, with occasional gaps. The signal service station at Yankton kept the temperatures, and those numbers survive in the federal weather records. October of 1880 ran from a high of 84 degrees down to a low of 15. November went from 67 down to 5 below zero. December from 64 down to 19 below. January of 1881 had a high of 36 and a low of 32 below zero. Look at that January again for a second. The warmest moment in the entire month was 36 degrees, which is not warm, it is merely above freezing. And the coldest was 32 degrees below. That is a swing of 68 degrees inside 4 weeks. And every one of those swings is a storm arriving or a storm leaving. And every arrival and departure is a day when nobody in that town could plan anything. February went from 52 down to 23 below. March 44 down to 8 below. April still touched 3 below zero. On the 27th of December, a paper over in Winona, Minnesota, reported that the mercury had fallen to 12 and 14 degrees below zero, and that some places were reporting 20 and 22 below. I should say one more thing about the measurements, because it is the sort of correction that matters more than it sounds. The climatological study that assembled all of this states plainly that neither the long-term climate records nor the historical data included any direct measurement of snowfall or snow depth during that winter. Nobody was measuring it. So every seasonal snowfall total you have ever heard attached to that winter, every figure about how many feet fell on Smet, is a story rather than a record. And those drifts of 15 to 25 feet in the Canton Advocate were drifts in the railroad cuts, which are trenches dug through rising ground so that a train can pass through it on the level. A railroad cut is a machine for catching snow. It fills first and it empties last. That is precisely why the trains stopped. Now, the trains. This is where the record gets untidy, and I am going to hand you the untidiness rather than pick the neatest version, because the untidiness is honest, and because the neat versions all disagree with each other anyway. One chapter-by-chapter study of the novel against the record puts the last passenger and freight train into Smet on the 18th of January. Another account describes a 100-day blockade running from the 13th of January through to the 6th of May. The climatological study, working against railroad archives, puts the cessation in late December, which would make the blockade closer to 5 months than to 3. Eliza Jane Wilder was living out there. She was Almanzo's older sister, and she would shortly become Laura's schoolteacher, and the two of them were not going to be friends. She wrote her account of the blockade the way a person remembers a season, rather than the way a clerk records one. Trains blocked 10 days after the October storm, she said, and then, after the middle of December, she thought no trains reached Smet at all until May. The end of it is not untidy in the slightest. On the 6th of May, 1881, at 4 in the afternoon, the first train got through to Volga. It carried a barrel of sugar and 2 barrels of whiskey. The first passenger train reached Smet on the 9th of May. It brought farming implements. Sit with that a moment, because it is a small and perfect piece of the truth about how supply actually works. 5 months of a blockaded town watching an empty line, and when the railroad finally comes through, it brings whiskey and plows. Not flour, not salt pork, not coal. The railroad brought whatever had been sitting on a siding to the east since December, and what had been sitting on that siding was a spring shipment for a farming season, ordered in the autumn by people who had no idea what was coming. Nobody sent a rescue. The schedule simply resumed, 5 months late, carrying the freight it had been carrying when it stopped. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Back inside the building, in October, with the whole of it still to come. The first thing a blockade takes from a Dakota town is not food. It is fuel. Understand the ground first. There is no timber on that prairie worth the name. There are no woods to cut. There is no fallen deadwood in a ravine, because there are almost no ravines, and there is certainly no wood in them. Everything a stove burns in Smet in 1880 arrives on a train, in the form of coal, from somewhere else entirely. Almanzo Wilder put a price on that coal, years later, in a letter to Rose Wilder Lane, written in March of 1937. Coal ran about $9 a ton, he told her. A winter took $60 or $75 of it. $60 to $75 for one household for one winter. Now let me tell you what that number meant to the man in that kitchen, because we can actually count what he earned. Charles Ingalls was, among many other things, the justice of the peace. It sounds like an office. It was more like piecework. He was paid by the case, and he heard the cases that a raw railroad town produced, which meant liquor prosecutions and disputes between men who had nothing much to dispute over. Across the documented payments from 1881 to 1885, the total comes to about $86. 5 years of holding a county office, hearing cases in his own front room, and the whole of it adds up to a little more than one winter's coal. His best year in that office was 1884, 3 cases and $41.85, and that was the good year. In 1885 he was elected again, and that appears to have been his last term, and in 1884 he had actually lost an election for the office before that. There is one more payment in the record, and I love it for how ordinary it is. In January of 1879, back in Minnesota, he was paid $21.54 for sundry bills in justice court. $21.54. That is not a wage, that is a reimbursement. Now I want to be very clear about what that means, because it would be easy to hear a run of numbers like that and conclude something unkind about the man. Charles Ingalls worked constantly. Look at the list of things he was, and it is not a list of ambitions, it is a list of jobs he actually did. Farmer, carpenter, hunter and trapper, railroad timekeeper and paymaster and camp overseer, storekeeper, bookkeeper, justice of the peace, deputy sheriff for 6 years, tax collector. The man had more occupations than most people have decades. That is not a story about a lazy man. That is a story about what all of those occupations were worth in cash, on a frontier where cash was the one thing that nobody had, and where the only reliable way to make money was to already have some. So when the coal ran out, the town did what the country around it had already learned to do. They burned the grass. Prairie hay burns badly. That is the first thing to know about it. It is light and it is full of air, and it goes up like paper, hot and fast, and then finished. To make it burn in a stove at all, in a way that gives off heat rather than just flame, you have to twist it. Hard. You take a double handful of long slough grass and you wind it against itself until it is a dense stick, tight enough to hold its own shape, and then you feed it in. It is a two-handed job, and it is not a gentle one. Slough hay is coarse. It has edges. Laura wrote about hands that were red and swollen and cold and covered in cuts from sharp slow hay, and even if you set the novel aside entirely, anyone who has handled that grass will tell you the same thing about what it does to skin. And here is how we know it was not one family's desperate improvisation. The Kingsbury County News reported hay burning in Smet in February of 1881. It was what the town did, and a few years on, a company in that same town manufactured hay-burning stoves and sold them commercially. That is the detail that tells you the truth about that country. It did not treat burning grass as an emergency. It treated burning grass as a market and built a piece of hardware for it. Now put the twisting into that back kitchen and count the hands. Charles Ingalls, 44, going out for the hay and twisting it. Laura, 13, twisting. Mary, 15 and blind, and here I want to be careful and also fair. Twisting hay is work done entirely by touch. It is repetitive, it is tactile, it requires no sight whatsoever, and a household with 9 people in it, and a fire that eats its fuel as fast as anybody can produce it, does not leave a pair of working hands idle. What the record establishes is that Mary was in that house, and that the household's whole fuel supply had to be made by hand every day. What it cannot establish is any particular hour of any particular day. I will leave the arithmetic where the evidence leaves it. Caroline, 40, cooking, and keeping a 3-year-old and a frail 10-year-old alive, and feeding a stove that consumes everything it is given. and a man of 27, sitting. He never went with Pa for a load of hay, he never twisted any. He just sat. I want to give George Masters whatever defense the record allows him, because it would be very easy and very cheap to spend the rest of tonight making a villain out of a man who cannot answer. So here it is, and it is a real defense. Every single word we have about his conduct that winter comes from Laura. It was written down by a woman of 70 about a young man she disliked when she was 13, 60 years after the fact, while she was constructing a novel. There is no second witness. There is no letter from Maggie. There is no note from Caroline. There is nothing in a newspaper. We have one side of a ledger and no way to audit it. But we do have one other thing, and it is the closest thing to a second voice that exists in this whole file. George Masters offered to pay for their room and board, and when the family finally left in the spring, by the account that survives, very little was actually handed over. Offered, not paid. Now sit with what that actually is. That is a young man who knows precisely what he owes, and cannot produce it. That is a 27-year-old with a wife, a first baby, a homestead claim he cannot reach, an employer whose railroad has effectively stopped existing, and no wages arriving from any direction, sitting in another man's kitchen and doing the same arithmetic every morning and getting the same answer every time. There is a particular kind of paralysis that comes over a person who is in debt to the people feeding them and has no way to change it. It looks, from across a room, exactly like a man not helping. It very often is a man not helping. And underneath it there is usually something else going on that nobody says out loud, then or later. Whether he should have gone out for the hay anyway is a different question, and Laura's answer to it is completely unambiguous, and she was in the room and we were not. Let's talk about the room itself, because 9 people in that plan is not an abstraction. It is a physical problem with a physical solution, and somebody had to work it out. Downstairs, front room and back kitchen, with the chimney between them. The front room was Pa's office. In a normal winter, it is where a justice of the peace hears a dispute about a liquor sale. In this winter, it is a cold box on the street side of a chimney, because that is what happens to a 2-room ground floor when fuel becomes the constraint. You stop heating the front. Everybody moves to the back, to the kitchen, to the side of the chimney where the cooking fire is, because a fire that is already burning to cook is a fire you are not paying twice for. 9 people, 1 warm room, all day, most days, for months. Upstairs there were the rooms under the roof, and there is a detail about those rooms that I am going to hand you now and then come back to at the very end of tonight, because it turns out to be the last piece of evidence in this entire story. In the long winter, Laura describes one window in the upstairs room. Photographs of that building, taken while it still stood, show 2. Hold that. Just hold it for now. Now, the food. Here is the thing about a household of 9 where 6 are children. Children do not eat less because the trains have stopped. A 3-year-old eats what a 3-year-old eats. A baby of 5 months, going on 8 months, going on a year, needs his mother fed, and a nursing mother in a cold house on short rations is one of the most fragile arrangements in the world. Every mouth in that building was a fixed cost, and the 2 women had to cover all 9 of them out of whatever came through the door. And what came through the door, once the store shelves in town thinned out, was wheat. Seed wheat, mostly, which is to say wheat that was never intended to be eaten by people at all, because seed wheat is next year's crop held back in a sack. You cannot eat wheat as it comes. It has to be ground, and the mills in a blockaded town are not necessarily running, and so the grinding gets done at home, in a coffee mill, which is a small hand-cranked box with a Burr grinder in it that was designed to do about a tablespoon of coffee beans at a time. Picture the labor in that. A coffee mill holds almost nothing. You put in a handful, you crank until it is through, you empty the little drawer, you put in another handful. To produce enough coarse flour for 1 day's bread for a household, somebody has to sit at that mill and turn it, and then somebody else takes over, and then the first person comes back. It is not dramatic work. That is exactly why it is so effective in the book, and why it stayed in the mind of everybody who ever read it. Nothing about it is heroic. It is just a handle, turning, all day, in a cold room, and if the handle stops, the bread stops. Now add 3 people to the household and run that mill again. That is a 50% increase in the amount of grinding required every single day for as long as the blockade lasts. Not a 50% increase in danger. A 50% increase in labor at a moment when the total available labor in that building was 1 man of 44, 1 woman of 40, and 2 teenage girls. I said we would talk about money in this town, so let me give you one number and then get out of the way. The reference price for wheat at the Smet elevator was 82 cents a bushel. A bushel of wheat weighs about 60 pounds, so 82 cents buys you 60 pounds of grain in a normal season, which is why nobody bothered to think about wheat as an expense at all. It was the cheapest thing in the country. It was so cheap that a farmer's entire year of labor came out the other end of it as almost nothing, which was the standing tragedy of that whole prairie economy, and the reason so many of these families were poor while surrounded by food they had grown themselves. Cheap, that is, when a train can move it. The moment the train stops, that 82-cent bushel becomes the most valuable object in the county, and it is not because it changed, it is because the distance changed. The wheat that was in De Smet on the 15th of October was all the wheat that was going to be in De Smet, and there is a hard number attached to it, and nobody knew what the number was. That is the true shape of the fear in that winter, and I don't think the book ever quite says it out loud. Nobody was starving in December. What nobody could do in December was count. You cannot ration against an unknown. You cannot tell your children this will be over in 9 weeks, because you do not know whether it will be 9 weeks or 20. So you cut everything, immediately, and you keep cutting, because the only strategy available against an unknown ending is to make today smaller. And 2 women did that arithmetic in a back kitchen for 9 people, one of whom was an infant, one of whom was blind, and 3 of whom were not their own family and could not be sent away. I keep thinking about the moment that decision got made, not a scene. There is no scene, and I am not going to invent one, but somewhere in late October or early November, in that building, it became clear to Caroline Ingalls that the 3 people upstairs were not leaving, and that whatever was in the house was now going to be divided 9 ways instead of 6. Nobody wrote down what she said. Nobody ever wrote down what Caroline Ingalls said about anything, which is its own kind of fact about that family. What we know is what happened. They stayed, they ate, the baby lived. And by February, in a house running on twisted grass and ground seed wheat, the young mother upstairs and the older woman downstairs had been keeping a child alive together for 4 months. So that is the inside of the building. Cold front room, warm back kitchen, 1 chimney, 2 upstairs windows, 9 people, a mill that has to be turned all day, and a fuel supply that has to be manufactured by hand every morning before it can be burned. So that is the shape of the machine. Now let's run it, month by month, and watch what it does to 9 people. October. The storm on the 15th is the one that changes the year, but the thing that made it dangerous is not the snow, it is the calendar. Eliza Jane Wilder remembered that the trains were blocked 10 days after that storm, which means the first blockade came in the last week of October, and then cleared, and then came again. That first blockage is the one that decides everything, because it lands in the exact week when a prairie town does its buying. Coal comes in October. Flour comes in October. Salt pork, kerosene, sugar, the whole winter's stock, ordered in September and delivered before the freeze, and paid for out of a crop that has just been sold. The Ingalls family came in off the claim after that storm. Whatever had already been laid in, they had. Whatever had not been laid in was now a question about a railroad. November. The Yankton station recorded a high of 67 that month and a low of 5 below zero. That range tells you it was not a continuous freeze. There were warm days. There were days when a man could get out and do something, and everybody in the county used them, because the useful days in a Dakota November are the last useful days there are going to be. Somewhere in that stretch, the household's arrangements harden. The Masters family has not gone. The upstairs rooms are occupied. The front room is starting to be a place you go into and come straight out of, because it is on the wrong side of the chimney. And the fuel question turns from a worry into a job. Hay does not gather itself. Somebody has to go out to a slough, cut, load, and haul, and then the whole household has to turn it into something a stove will accept. That is the point at which a man who does not come out to the wagon becomes a fact that everybody in the building can see. December. High of 64, low of 19 below. The trains are now missing rather than late. The climatological study puts the cessation in late December, and the railroad archives agree with it, and Eliza Jane's memory agrees with it too, that after the middle of the month nothing got through at all. On the 27th, the paper over in Winona reported 12 and 14 degrees below zero, with places reporting 20 and 22 below. And on the 1st of December, in that town, Charles Ingalls formally relinquished the homestead claim he had been holding in Minnesota since May of 1878. I want to stop on that, because it is the kind of thing that only shows up in a land office file and never shows up in a story. There is no drama in a relinquishment. It is a piece of paper. But think about what it is. It is the last remaining line of retreat. It is the ground you could have gone back to. And in the first week of the worst winter that country would ever record, with 3 unexpected people in his house and a fuel supply made of grass, Charles Ingalls let go of the only other piece of land he had a claim on anywhere in the world. Whether that was a decision or an expiry, the file does not say, but the date is the date. On the 1st of December 1880, the Dakota claim became the only claim. Then Christmas. The novel makes a great deal of Christmas, and so did Laura when she was building the book. Her letters with Rose in 1937 work over exactly where to put a Christmas barrel in the story and where to put the Boasts, the neighbors who in the real winter were out on their farm. She wrote to Rose about the Boasts in a sentence that shows you her hand on the material. There are more objections, she said, to moving the Boasts to town to live with us. Leaving them on the farm all winter shows the fear of the storms. That is a novelist talking, not a liar, a builder. She is deciding where a family should be standing in order to make the reader feel the right thing about the weather, and she is weighing it, and she is writing the reasons down. Keep that sentence, because in about half an hour I am going to show you the same hand making a different decision about 3 other people, and the 2 decisions were made in the same year by the same woman at the same desk. January. High of 36, low of 32 below zero, the lowest single month on the whole index since 1864. And here is the household detail that I think is the most quietly awful thing in this entire story, and it has nothing to do with food. Out of 59 days across January and February, snow was probably falling somewhere in that region on 47 of them. That means the sky was closed. Day after day after day. No horizon, no sun, no shadow on the floor. In a 2-room ground floor where the front room is unheated and everybody is in the back kitchen, that is 9 people in one room with the light the color of a dishcloth for weeks. Now think about Mary. Mary Ingalls was 15. She had been blind since the summer of 1879, so about 18 months by that January. Blindness in a house is survivable because a house is learnable. You learn the distance from the stove to the table. You learn where the chair is, and you learn not to move it. 9 people is not a learnable house. 9 people means the chair moves. It means somebody has left a basket where the basket does not go, and a stranger's boots are by the door, and there is a baby on the floor somewhere that you cannot see and must not step on. Nobody wrote any of that down. I am not going to pretend anybody did, but we know she was there, and we know how many people were in those rooms, and we know that for a person who navigates by memory, another family moving in is not company. It is the ground shifting. and a note on how she came to be blind, because the family itself was never sure. Laura at different times attributed it to measles, to brain fever, to spinal meningitis, to scarlet fever, to high fever and strokes. A medical study published in 2013 concluded that the likeliest cause was a viral inflammation of the brain rather than scarlet fever at all, which is to say that the most famous illness in American children's literature was probably not the illness the books named, and the people closest to it did not know either. February. High of 52, low of 23 below. The Kingsbury County News reports hay burning in Smet that month, so we know for certain that by February the town as a whole had moved off coal and onto grass. And by February, the 2 women in that kitchen have been feeding 9 people for about 4 months. This is the month in which the seed wheat becomes the thing that everybody remembers, and the coffee mill goes on the table, and the grinding starts. I want to be honest about what the evidence supports there. Laura's own account of her family's shelves, written years before the novel, is specific and it is grim. No meat, the butter gone, the potatoes nearly gone, dried fruit and coffee gone from the stores in town, tea scarce, only small quantities of sugar and wheat. That is a household running on grain and very little else, in a room heated by burning grass, in the coldest February that anybody in that county would ever see. March. High of 44. Low of 8 below. And nothing changes. That is the thing about March in that country. It looks like the end, and it is not the end. The temperature comes up, and the drifts do not go anywhere, because a drift that has been building since October in a railroad cut is not a snowbank. It is a structure. It has layers in it, and ice lenses, and it survives thaws that would take a foot of fresh snow off a field in an afternoon. So March is the month of false endings. A warm week, and then nothing on the line. Another warm week, and still nothing on the line. April. Here is the number that surprised me most in the whole weather file. The Yankton station recorded a high of 79 degrees in April of 1881. 79 degrees, and in the same month, a low of 3 below zero. You can hear what that does to people. 79 degrees is a day when you take your coat off. It is a day when a child goes outside and stays outside. It is a day that feels, unmistakably, like the thing is over, and then it goes to 3 below. 6 months of that. Storm, gap, false spring, hard freeze. That is the actual texture of the hard winter, and it is not the texture of a siege, which is what novels have to make it into. A siege is one long condition. This was a series of raised and dashed expectations across 6 months, in a house with 9 people in it, who could not go anywhere and could not plan anything and could not be sure of a single week. And then May. On the 6th, at 4 in the afternoon, the first train got through to Volga. On the 9th, the first passenger train came into Smet. The Yankton station recorded a high of 88 degrees that month and a low of 38. The thing simply stopped, the way weather does, without any acknowledgement at all of what it had just done. 9 people had gone into that building in October. 9 people came out of it. Nobody in that house died. Not the blind girl, not the frail 10-year-old, not the 3-year-old, and not the baby who was 5 months old when it started and a year old when it ended. That fact does not appear in any book, and it cannot appear, because to state it you would have to count to 9. That is the winter as the Ingalls family lived it, and everything I have just told you is supported either by the physical record of that country or by Laura's own account of her own household. But if you walk out of that door and go 100 yards up the street, the story changes so completely that when I first read the town's own newspaper, I had to go back and read it twice. Because while that kitchen was grinding seed wheat in a coffee mill, Smet had a working grist mill, a school in session, and a man writing to the outside world to say that nobody there was suffering. I have told the story of that winter on this channel before, more than once, and I have told it the way almost everybody tells it. A town on the edge of starving. 5 months of blizzards. Flour gone, meat gone, the last of the wheat in a sack in the wall. I need to show you what the town's own newspaper was printing while it was happening, because it does not say that, and it took me a while to work out what to do with it. The Kingsbury County News, on the 24th of February, 1881, reported that the first grist of wheat ground into Smet was on the 5th of that month, by Dan Loftus. A grist is a quantity of grain taken to a mill and ground. So there was a mill. It was running by the 5th of February, and a named man in that town was operating it. The same paper reported that the school had 26 students, with good average attendance, and that it was going bravely on. The county school superintendent was a man named Amos Whiting, and he filed a report on the 23rd of March recording that same enrollment of 26 children with good daily attendance. School, all winter. 26 children getting there and getting home again, in a season with snow falling on 47 days out of 59, and a superintendent writing it down twice because it was worth writing down that the thing was still running. And I need you to notice what that does to the novel, because it is the sharpest single contradiction in this entire file. In the long winter, the school closes. It is one of the small early losses that tells the reader how serious the thing is getting. The teacher shuts the door, the children go home, and after that the town contracts to the size of individual kitchens. The county superintendent's report says the school was open, with 26 enrolled and good daily attendance, in March of 1881. Both of those can be true, and here is how. A school in that country in that decade was not a continuous institution the way we think of one. It ran in terms. It closed for storms and opened again. A superintendent writing an annual figure is recording an enrollment and an average, not a promise that the door opened every single morning. But an enrollment of 26 with good average attendance is not a school that shut for the winter. It is a school that kept going. So somewhere in that town, through the worst season on the record, 24 children were walking to a schoolhouse on the days it was possible to walk, and their teacher was there, and somebody was keeping the register. That is not a detail. That is a different town from the one in the book. On the 12th of March, a De Smet man named George Wilmarth wrote that there was no suffering there, and that the town could hold out a month longer. In late April, another resident, Charles Keith, wrote to knock down a rumour that had gotten loose out in the wider country. Somebody had put it about that 140 coffins had been ordered for the town of Brookings. Keith wrote back that there had been no suffering in De Smet, and only 1 or 2 cases of sickness. And a letter from the 31st of March records that antelope, deer and elk had been killed in great numbers that winter. Antelope, deer, elk. Put all of that together and you get a summary that one researcher, working through the newspaper record of that season, states about as bluntly as it can be stated. The report suggests that only sugar and tobacco were in dire short supply in De Smet that winter. Sugar and tobacco. Now, I am not going to stand here and tell you that the hard winter was a myth, because it was not, and I have just spent half an hour showing you that it was not. The instruments say it was one of the most severe winters ever recorded at that latitude, the lowest monthly reading in the history of the index. Snow on 47 days out of 59. The railroad archives say the trains stopped for months, and the first one back in May brought sugar and whiskey because there was nothing else on the siding to bring. Eliza Jane Wilder, who had no book to sell and no reputation at stake, wrote that after the middle of December, nothing got through until May. All of that is real. None of it is in dispute. What the town's own record says is something narrower and much stranger, and it is the hinge that this whole story turns on. So let me say it as carefully as I can. The town of De Smet did not starve that winter. One household in it came very close. And I want to be fair to Laura here, because the moment you put those 2 sentences side by side, it starts to sound like an accusation, and it should not. Laura's own account of that winter, the one she wrote in her autobiographical manuscript years before the novel, is an account of her family's shelves. No meat, the butter gone, the potatoes nearly gone, dried fruit and coffee gone from the stores in town, tea scarce, only small quantities of sugar and wheat. Every word of that can be true at the same time as everything the newspapers printed, because they are describing two different things. Laura is describing a pantry. The newspapers are describing a town. A town has 30 households in it. Some of them had a good year behind them. Some of them had a store. Some of them had a rifle and the time to use it. And antelope came through that country in numbers we would not believe now. Some of them were young men with no dependents who could live on almost nothing for a season and think it an adventure. And one of them had 9 people in it, 6 of them children, 2 of them unable to work, 1 of them at the breast, and a man whose entire year had gone into land, lumber, and a claim. So the question changes completely. It stops being a question about weather, because weather falls on everybody equally. Robert Boast was under that sky. Dan Loftus was, Amos Whiting was, and Edward Cowes, and John Carroll, and Margaret Garland, and Almanzo, and Royal Wilder, and about 30 households in all. The real question, the one the novel cannot ask because the novel has removed the evidence for it, is this. Why was the Ingalls kitchen so much closer to the edge than the kitchens on either side of it? And the answer to that is not in the weather record at all. It is in the land office. To understand why Charles Ingalls walked into the worst winter in living memory with nothing whatsoever in reserve, you have to go back 20 years and follow the money, not the drama, the money. Every deed, every filing, every relinquishment, in order. I will warn you now that this is going to be the least romantic stretch of tonight. It is also the part that explains everything, and by the end of it, I do not think you will hear that kitchen the same way again. Start in 1860. On the 1st of February, Charles Ingalls marries Caroline Quiner at Concord in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. They live on land he had bought from his own father 3 years earlier, by warranty deed. So he begins his married life as a landowner at the age of 23, which in that generation was a good start. 1863, he and his brother-in-law Henry Quiner put down $335 for 160 acres in Pepin Township, 80 acres each. The Ingalls take the south half and the Quiners the north. That is the big woods. That is the log house. Mary is born there in January of 1865 and Laura in February of 1867. 1868, and here the pattern begins. In May he sells the Pepin farm to a man named Gustav Gustafsson for about $1,000, and on the 28th of May of that same year he buys 80 acres in Chariton County, Missouri, sight unseen, from a land agent named Adamantine Johnson, and takes on a $900 debt to do it. Sight unseen, $900. That is a man buying ground he has never walked on, from a professional who makes his living selling ground to people who have never walked on it, and financing it against the sale of the farm he already had. Then the whole thing falls over, and it falls over in the most ordinary way imaginable, which is the way most 19th century families were ruined. Gustav Gustafsson defaults on the Wisconsin mortgage. The money Charles was counting on to pay Johnson does not arrive. And on the 25th of February 1870, in Independence, Kansas, the Missouri transaction is formally cancelled. Notice where they are standing when that cancellation goes through. Kansas. Which brings us to the second loss. The family is on the Osage Diminished Reserve, less than 10 miles from Independence. They are squatting. That is not a slur, it is the legal position, and thousands of families were in it, and the government's own confusion about what that land was and who could have it is the reason. Then in 1871, a survey comes through and establishes something that no amount of hard work can argue with. Charles Ingalls has built his house on a school section. Section 36, in the federal survey grid, is set aside. It is not open to preemption at the settler's price. It carried a minimum of $3 an acre, and the whole point of the arrangement was that the proceeds of those sections funded schools. There is no appeal. There is no compensation for improvements. He built a house, broke ground, and dug a well on land he could never have owned, and the record does not show anybody making him whole for a day of it. They go back to Wisconsin, to the same farm, not because it was a plan, but because Gustafson had defaulted and the land had come back to them by failure rather than by fortune. That is the second time in 3 years that this family's direction is set by somebody else's inability to pay. They farm it until October of 1873 and then sell it to a man named Andrew Anderson for $1,000 and go west again. Now the third loss, and this is the one I find hardest to look at, Minnesota, Plum Creek in North Hero Township, Redwood County. The family settles on the 24th of May, 1874, and files a preemption on the 26th of June on 172 acres. They live in a dugout cut into the creek bank. There is a house eventually. There is wheat in the ground, and wheat in that valley in that decade was the whole plan, for everybody. Then the grasshoppers come. Rocky Mountain locusts in 1874, and again in 1875, and again in 1876. The major invasion arrives on the 15th of July 1874, which is to say, it arrives about 6 weeks after this family got there. 3 crops, 3 years, gone. And now watch what happens on paper, because this is the single most brutal pair of dates in the whole ledger. On the 7th of July 1876, Charles Ingalls pays $430.18 to perfect that preemption, $2.50 an acre, which was the doubled rate that applied inside a railroad land grant. He has now, legally and completely, bought that land. It is his. On the 10th of July 1876, 3 days later, he sells it to a man named Abraham Keller for $400. 3 days, $30.18 down on the transaction alone, and that is before you count the house, before the breaking of the sod, before the dugout, before 2 years of a family's labor, before anything at all that a human being put into that ground. I do not know what happened in those 3 days, and I am not going to guess, because it would be easy to write a scene, and it would be fiction. What I can tell you is what the arithmetic looks like from the outside. A man completes a purchase and then immediately liquidates it at a loss. That is what it looks like when somebody has to have cash and has run out of other ways to get it. That is what leaving looked like on the ledger. And there is more, because the Minnesota years have a second and a third filing in them that almost nobody has ever mentioned. He filed a tree claim in June of 1875 on land another man had abandoned and relinquished it in March of 1878, and he filed a homestead claim in Minnesota in May of 1878 and relinquished it on the 1st of December 1880. Look very carefully at that last date. The 1st of December 1880. That is the hard winter. The family has been in Dakota for more than a year. The blizzards have already started. And a man sitting in a store building in Smet, in a blockaded town, was still holding a claim in Minnesota on paper and let it go in the middle of that winter. That claim does not appear anywhere in any of Laura's published books. And then Burr Oak, Iowa, which Laura did write down, just not for publication. They went to Iowa in the late summer of 1876, after the third grasshopper year, because a man named William Stedman had bought a hotel there and asked Charles to help run it. On the way, they stopped at Charles's brother Peter's farm near South Troy, Minnesota. And there, on the 27th of August, 1876, their son Charles Frederick died. He was 9 months old. They buried him and went on to Iowa because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. In Burr Oak, they lived first in the hotel itself, a building cut into a hillside with a saloon next door, then in rented rooms above a grocery, while Charles worked at a feed mill, then in a rented house in a wooded part of town where Grace was born on the 23rd of May, 1877, and in the spring of 1877, they left that town at night. The landlord, a man named Bisbee, would not extend the rent and had threatened to seize their horses. There were doctor's bills outstanding and a grocery bill. So a family walked their team out of an Iowa town in the dark in order to keep the team. Laura recorded that. It is in her own autobiographical manuscript, in her own account. The published books do not contain it. The scholar who edited that manuscript notes plainly that in the novels, Pa would never have behaved this way. I am not telling you this to knock a man down. I am telling you because you cannot understand what happened in that kitchen in 1881 without it. By the time the Ingalls family reached Dakota Territory in 1879, Charles Ingalls had been buying, breaking, improving and losing land for 19 years. He had done it in Wisconsin, in Missouri on paper, in Kansas, in Wisconsin again, in Minnesota twice over. He had put up buildings and dug wells and broken sod and planted trees on ground in 4 states. And here is the summary that the land records support, and it is one of the bleakest sentences in American frontier history. Across more than 30 years of property ownership in 5 states and a territory, Charles Ingalls' net profit from every land transaction he ever made came to less than $400. Less than $400. 30 years. Now put that man in October of 1880 and look at what he is actually holding. He filed on a Dakota homestead in February of that year at the Brookings Land Office. Proving up a homestead means living on it and improving it, which means breaking sod and planting trees, which means labor that returns nothing at all until years later, and then only if you are still standing. He has just spent a summer and his materials putting up a 2-story frame commercial building in town. That is capital going out, not coming in. He is holding a Minnesota claim that he will surrender in December. He has a county office that pays a few dollars a case, when it pays, and in the very best year it ever gave him, it produced $41.85. And the coal for one winter cost $60 to $75. That is a man whose entire net worth is in land, timber, lumber, and future promises, at the exact moment that a season arrives which will only accept coal, flour, and meat. That is why that kitchen was different from the kitchen next door. Not because the Ingalls family was unluckier with weather. 30 households were under the same sky. They were poorer in the one currency that the winter would take, and they were poorer in it because of 19 years of arithmetic that had gone the wrong way every single time. And they had 9 people to divide it among instead of 6. That is the whole thesis of tonight, and I want to state it as plainly as I can, because it is easy to hear this as an attack on a book, and it is not one. The Long Winter is a true account of what one family went through. The Smet newspapers are a true record of what a town went through. Both are true. The gap between them is not a lie. The gap is the story. And Laura closed the gap by removing 3 people. Because look at what the Masters family does to the arithmetic of that novel. The book works because you can do the sums in your head while you read it. 1 sack of seed wheat in the wall, 6 people, a coffee mill that produces enough for 1 day's bread if somebody turns it all day. It is a closed system, and closed systems are where dread lives. You can feel the sack going down. Add 3 more people, and the sums stop closing. A scholar working chapter by chapter through the novel against the historical record notes it flatly, in a parenthesis, almost in passing. The per-person wheat calculations only hold if you ignore the Masters family. Read that again, because it is the most damning small sentence in this entire file, and it is not damning in the way you might expect. The book's own arithmetic is internally consistent only because 3 people had been taken out of the arithmetic. She did not merely leave them out of the cast, she left them out of the sums. And now the wheat. I have told the story of the wheat run on this channel before, the way almost everybody tells it, because it is one of the great pieces of American storytelling. 2 young men, Almanzo Wilder and Cap Garland, going out onto open prairie in February with a short winter afternoon in front of them, and no certainty at all that there was any wheat out there to be found, and coming back before dark with the seed that carried a town to spring. I have to tell you what the record actually holds about it, and it is not comfortable. There are no newspaper accounts of that ride, none before The Long Winter was published in 1940, and none after. The Smet News did not mention it even once the novel had made it famous, when it would have been the best local story in a generation, and the easiest column any editor ever wrote. The farmer the novel calls Mr. Anderson was a real man. His name was Niels Anderson Copperud. He was born near Oslo in 1853, and had been in America since 1873, and he used Anderson on his claim filings and in business, and Copperud in the census and at home, which is a very common thing for a Norwegian immigrant of that generation to have done. His preemption lay south and slightly west of Smet, about 6 miles out. The novel says 12. The amounts move around too. Laura's manuscript says 30 bushels. The published book says 60. There is a version in which each of the two young men obtained 60. The elevator price of reference in Smet was 82 cents a bushel, and the escalating prices the storekeeper charges in the novel, $1.50, then $2.50, then $3, are fiction, very fine fiction, because they turn a shortage into a moral test and give the town a scene it can win. On the timing, Laura wrote to Rose to make it as early as possible. Copperud's own homestead proof from 1887 records that he grew crops for 6 seasons beginning in the summer of 1881, and that he took 75 bushels of oats off 5 acres in that first year. That is consistent with a man who had sold off his seed wheat and had to start again with something else. It is not proof that he did. So what do we actually have? We have Laura's testimony, given decades later, and nothing else at all. And the 6 miles is not the only measurement in that book that moved. Almanzo Wilder was 10 years older than Laura. In the books he reads as about 6 years older, which is a great deal more comfortable when the girl in question is 15 and the man is 25. The chapter in which a warning about Indians arrives at the store appears to be substantially invented. The escalating prices in the storekeeper's scene are fiction. The distance to the wheat doubled. None of those are lies, in any sense that matters. They are the ordinary adjustments a writer makes when a true thing is not shaped like a story. 12 miles is frightening, and 6 miles is a morning. A man 6 years older is a suitor, and a man 10 years older is a different kind of arithmetic in a reader's head. But once you have seen 4 of them, you start to understand that The Long Winter is a built object, engineered joint by a woman of 70 who knew exactly what she was doing, and that the removal of 3 people from the household is not an oversight in that object. It is one of the load-bearing decisions. Now, that is not the same as saying it did not happen, and I want to be precise about the difference, because this is where a lot of people go wrong in both directions. Small towns are full of things that everybody knew and nobody printed. A weekly newspaper in a blockaded town with no train, no newsprint coming, and no way to distribute is not a comprehensive record of anything. Whole winters go unrecorded in places like that. And Almanzo Wilder's own obituary in 1949 says that he once saved his snowbound town from starving by driving 40 miles through a blizzard for wheat. So the story was in the town's mouth by the time he died, though by then the novel had been out for 9 years and had already taught the town its own history. What I can tell you is this: the ride is the one load-bearing beam of that novel which rests entirely on a single person's memory, and the 3 people who were sitting in the kitchen on the day it is supposed to have happened were not allowed into the book to corroborate anything. There is one more thing about that town in that winter that I think gets lost, and it is worth 30 seconds. Everybody was there, not a cast assembled later by a novelist. Everybody, already, in one blockaded town of about 30 households. Almanzo Wilder was there, with his older brother Royal, and a feed store, holding seed wheat he had grown at Marshall, Minnesota. 5 years later, he would marry the 13-year-old girl grinding wheat in the store building down the street. His age that winter is one of the small mysteries of this family. Every headstone and every published book gives his birth year as 1857, which would make him 23 that winter and 10 years older than Laura. But the censuses of 1860, 1870, and 1875 all point to 1859. The likeliest explanation is the least romantic one. A man had to be 21 to file a homestead claim, and when Almanzo Wilder filed his in 1879, he would have been 19, so he aged himself 2 years, and then he kept it, for the rest of his life, all the way onto the stone. His sister Eliza Jane was there, keeping the account of the blockade that historians still use. Within 2 years, she would be Laura's schoolteacher, and the two of them would dislike each other so thoroughly that Laura was still settling the score in print in the 1940s. Cap Garland was there. His actual name was Oscar Edmund Garland, and he was 16. His family had arrived in Smet that same year and opened a boarding house on 2nd Street, which is why his mother was the woman standing beside Caroline Ingalls at a birth in May. She ran a house full of strangers for a living. She knew what to do. In 10 years he would be dead at 26, killed when a steam threshing engine exploded. And George Masters was there, whose sister would become Nellie Oleson, and whose father had taught Laura to read. One winter, one blockade, one street. Almost every person who would matter to the 8 books, in the same half-mile of snow, in the same 5 months, and most of them written out or written over by the time the books came. Let me go back into the room now, because there is a version of that winter that nobody has ever written down, and it belongs to Maggie. Here is her position, stated plainly. She is a young woman, married about 18 months. She has a first baby who was born in May and who will be a year old before this ends. She is living in another woman's house, cooking on another woman's stove, eating food she cannot pay for, in a town where she is nobody's daughter and has no relatives at all. Her husband is not working because there is no work, and every morning that he does not go out with Charles Ingalls for hay is a morning when the temperature in that kitchen drops a little in a way that no stove can fix. She cannot leave. That is the part that we forget, because we live in a world with roads. There is no leaving. The trains have stopped. A woman with an infant does not walk out of a blockaded town in January into open country in a season with snow falling on 4 days out of 5. Whatever is happening in that building is happening to her until May, and she knows it in November. And she is being judged. We know that for certain, because the judgment survived in writing for 60 years. But here is the thing I find genuinely moving in a story that has very little comfort in it. Every single recorded grievance in Laura's account is aimed at George, not at Maggie. The anger that lasted 6 decades had exactly one target, and it was the man who sat by the fire. Nobody in that family ever put down a word against the girl with the baby. Caroline Ingalls took her in. That is not nothing. By the account that survives, Caroline felt sorry for her and agreed to have her because she had nowhere else to go, and then Caroline knelt down beside her in an upstairs room in May and helped her have her son. Think about what those 2 women had in common by February. Caroline Ingalls had buried a son of her own, Charles Frederick, 9 months old, in Minnesota in 1876, 4 years before this winter, and still close enough to touch. She had a blind daughter of 15, and a frail daughter of 10, and a 3-year-old, in a house where the fuel was grass and the flour was seed wheat. And upstairs there was a young mother with a boy who did not know that anything was wrong, who was warm, who was fed, because in that kitchen the baby got fed first. Somebody made that decision. Every day, for 5 months, somebody made that decision, and the somebody was almost certainly the 2 women, because that is who makes that decision in a house. The book has none of this in it. The book has 6 people and a coffee mill. I want to be honest about one more thing before we come out of that winter, because I have been fairly hard on the novel tonight, and the novel deserves better than that. There is nothing dishonest about what Laura did. A novel is not a census. She was not writing a report. She was building something that would work on a child reading it in a warm house 60 years later, and the thing she built has outlasted every account written by anybody who was more scrupulous about the facts. And the strange truth of it is that if she had left the Masters family in, the book would almost certainly be worse. 9 people is a boarding house. It is a social situation. It has politics in it, and grievances, and the low, awful hum of an obligation nobody can discharge. All of that is fascinating to us sitting here, and all of it would have wrecked the thing she was making, which was a story about a family alone against weather. She knew that. That is exactly what she told her daughter, in so many words, while she was doing it. So this is not a story about a woman who lied. It is a story about what a good writer has to leave outside a door in order to build something that lasts, and about the 3 people who were standing on the other side of that door the whole time. And in May, the world came back. The Masters family left that spring. We do not have a day for it, and I am not going to invent one. Sometime after the 6th of May, 3 people walked out of that building with a 1-year-old boy, and behind them, a family of 6 had their rooms back. And then something happened that I did not expect when I started pulling these records, and it is the reason this story is worth 2 hours of a night rather than 5 minutes of one. Nothing turned into a feud. George Masters got on with it. He kept his claim. He went to work for the Empire Lumber Company in Smet, and he stayed there roughly 12 years. 12 years in a lumber yard, in a treeless country, selling the one material that every single building in that county had to be made of, and that none of it could grow. That is about the most necessary and least glamorous work that place had to offer, and it is steady, and he did it for over a decade. And in 1886, when Charles Ingalls finally went to prove up his homestead, when he needed sworn witnesses to stand behind his claim that he had lived on that land and improved it, one of the men who put his name to it was George Masters. 5 years after the winter. I want you to sit with that, because it is the most surprising fact in this entire file, and it changes the temperature of everything. Whatever passed between a 13-year-old girl and a 27-year-old man in a cold kitchen did not pass between the 2 grown men. On the day that a 30-year gamble finally came good, out of a whole county of possible witnesses, Charles Ingalls chose George Masters to swear that the land was his. That is not what you do to a man you resent. That is what you do to a friend. Let me tell you what that claim actually was, since we have followed the money this far. The homestead was the northeast quarter of Section 3, Township 110 North, Range 56 West, in Kingsbury County, a house 14 feet by 20, with an addition 12 by 16, a barn 16 by 24, 60 acres broken, 2,000 fruit trees, apple and plum, estimated value at proof, $1,000. Final proof, the 7th of May, 1886. Patent issued the 11th of May, 1886. Final certificate number 2708. After 26 years of buying and losing ground in 5 states, Charles Ingalls owned a farm outright. 2,000 fruit trees, apple and plum, planted on the open Dakota prairie by a man in his late 40s who had been burned by every single piece of land he ever touched. He went out and put 2,000 trees in the ground anyway, on the theory that in 10 years there would be an orchard where there had never been so much as a windbreak. I keep coming back to that number because it is the most hopeful thing this man ever did, and it is written in a federal file rather than in a book. Here is what happened to it. In April of 1891, he mortgaged that homestead for $760. On the 18th of February 1892, he sold it to a man named George Elderkin for $1,200. The trees went with it. 2,000 of them, 6 years planted, just coming to the age where a prairie apple tree starts to be worth something. And 2 months before that sale, in December of 1891, he had opened a notions store in town under the name Ingalls and Company, in a building belonging to Royal Wilder. It ran until late in 1893. Then he rented space in a brick building for about a year and closed for good in October of 1894. Look at the sequence and the arithmetic explains itself. Mortgage the farm in April, open the store in December, sell the farm in February. That is not a man expanding. That is a man converting the last asset he has into stock on a shelf, and hoping the shelf pays better than the ground did. It did not. The store building on Lot 21, the one with 2 windows upstairs, he had already let go years earlier. He sold it in October of 1885 for $600 on a property the county had assessed at $160. That is the one transaction in this entire ledger where Charles Ingalls came out well ahead of the assessment, and it was on the building he made with his own hands rather than on any acre of soil he ever broke. In the spring of 1886, John Carroll wanted that lot for a brick bank, and the Ingalls building was moved bodily east and turned to face a different street. It stood there, in its new position, facing the wrong way, until they pulled it down in April of 1919. The house where 9 people spent the hard winter came down 38 years after the hard winter. By then, 2 of the 9 were already dead, and Laura Ingalls Wilder was 52 years old and had not yet published a book. Now, before we get to the books, I want to give you the other consequence of that winter, and it is a bigger one, and it goes almost entirely unmentioned. In November of 1881, 6 months after the first train came back, Mary Ingalls left home. She enrolled at the Iowa College for the Blind at Vinton on the 23rd of November 1881. She was 16, she stayed 7 years, and she graduated on the 12th of June 1889. And here is the part that almost nobody knows, and it corrects one of the most beloved beliefs about this family. The territory of Dakota paid for it. Tuition, room, board, and books. The family did not carry that cost. I want to be careful and generous here, because the version most people carry is a story about sacrifice, and it is not a stupid story. It comes from the books, and in the books the money for Mary's schooling is a real and painful subject, and Laura's own teaching wages are part of the family's arithmetic in a way that is entirely true. But the institutional record is the institutional record. A blind girl from a territory that had made education for the blind a public responsibility went to a college that the territory paid for, and she came out of it 7 years later, able to read raised print, to write, to do fine handwork, and to be, in the language of the time, educated. Which means the true story is stranger and rather better than the myth. Charles Ingalls, who never in his life made money out of a piece of ground, got his blind daughter the best 7 years of education available to a blind person in America in that decade, because somebody in a territorial legislature had written a line into a budget. 6 months after the worst winter that country would ever record, that family's most vulnerable member walked onto a train that had only just started running again and went east to school for 7 years. That is the actual thing that winter made possible, and there is not a word of it in any novel. While we are at it, let me finish the wheat, because there is one number left in that file, and it is the number that tells you how thin the margin really was. Almanzo Wilder held 50 bushels of seed from his 1880 crop, grown at Marshall, Minnesota. In the manuscript stage of the novel, that figure was revised down to 30, and in the spring of 1881, after the blockade lifted, Almanzo Wilder planted 5 acres of wheat. 5 acres. That is a young man who came out of that winter with almost nothing left to put in the ground, in a country where wheat was the only crop anybody believed in. Whatever else happened out on that prairie in February of 1881, the man at the center of the story started the next season with 5 acres. Now let's take Charles Ingalls the rest of the way, because he has earned it, and because the end of his story is the beginning of somebody else's. He kept the county offices as long as they would have him. He was appointed constable when Kingsbury County organized on the 9th of March, 1880. He was appointed Justice of the Peace to replace a man who had moved away, and he was first noted as an elected justice in the Smet leader in January of 1883. He was defeated in the 1884 election and elected again in 1885, and that was his last term. He filed one more tree claim in December of 1884 on a cancelled claim of another man's and relinquished it on the 8th of June 1885, He held it for under a year. That is the last piece of land Charles Ingalls ever filed on, and he let it go in 6 months. In June of 1886, a lot on 3rd Street in Smet was purchased. It was purchased in Caroline's name. I do not know what conversation preceded that, and there is no letter about it, and I am not going to write the scene. What I can tell you is that after 26 years of watching land go through her husband's hands and come out the other side as nothing, the ground under the last house they would ever share was put in her name. Charles built the house on it in 1887, and the family moved in on Christmas Eve of that year. He lived there for another 14 years and a half. On Sunday the 8th of June, 1902, at 3 in the afternoon, Charles Ingalls died in that house. He was 66 years old. Heart trouble, after what the paper called a lingering illness of several weeks. The Smet News and Leader ran the obituary under the headline, "A Pioneer Gone." The people of Smet were pained Sunday afternoon, it begins, to learn of the death of Mr. C.P. Ingalls, who died at 3 in the afternoon of that day after a lingering illness of several weeks. Heart trouble was the cause of his death. It goes on the way a small-town paper goes on about a man everybody knew. As a citizen he was held in high esteem, being honest and upright in his dealings and associations with his fellows. As friend and neighbour, he was always kind and courteous, and as a husband and father, he was faithful and loving. And then the closing line, which is the one that gets me. There remained to mourn his death a wife and 4 daughters, Mrs. Laura Wilder, Mrs. Grace Dow, and Mrs. Carrie and Mary Ingalls. 4 daughters. There had been 5 children. Charles Frederick had been in a grave in Minnesota for 26 years by then, and a newspaper obituary is not the place where a family's whole arithmetic gets printed. The funeral was held on the Tuesday forenoon at the Congregational Church, the church whose first service in that town had been held in a building of his. He was buried in the Smet Cemetery with full Masonic rites. Laura came up on the train from Missouri and got there in time to see him. That much the family accounts agree on. He had spent 19 years turning labor into paper and paper into nothing, and then 16 more years in one town, in one house, on a lot in his wife's name. And in the whole of that life, the one thing he built that turned a genuine profit was a wooden store on a main street, which somebody else moved sideways in 1886 and knocked down in 1919. Caroline outlived him by 22 years, and in those 22 years, she did one thing that belongs in this story and nowhere else. In 1912, she sold that 3rd Street house to her daughter Mary. The consideration recorded on the instrument is $1 plus love and affection. That is the actual language. $1 plus love and affection, which is what a deed says when a piece of property is being moved for a reason that has nothing to do with money. Mary was blind, unmarried, 47 years old, and had no way on earth to earn a living in that country. What income she had came from making fly nets for horses, sewn by touch and sold to men with teams, and from renting out part of the house. The family that took those rooms were named Green. That is the household economy of the last Ingalls house in Smet, stated in full. A blind woman's handwork and a lodger. And her mother, who had spent a lifetime watching how fast a family's footing goes, put the deed in the blind daughter's name while she was still alive to do it. That is a woman who had learned something in a back kitchen in 1881 and never wrote a word of it down anywhere. Caroline Ingalls died on the 20th of April 1924. Mary was 59. She went first to live with Grace and her husband at Manchester, about 7 miles west of Smet. Then in June of 1927 she went to Carrie, in Keystone, out in the Black Hills, 300 miles from the only town she had ever really lived in. She died at Carrie's house on the 17th of October 1928 after a stroke. She was 63. She was brought back and buried at Smet. Now, George and Maggie. After the 12 years at Empire Lumber, George Masters moved his family to Spencer, in McCook County, South Dakota, and managed a lumber yard there. They had 9 children. Maggie Masters died in Spencer in 1904. George died in Spencer in 1913. I cannot give you their exact dates, and I cannot give you a cemetery, because the records I could reach disagree with each other, and I am not going to put a headstone in a place where I cannot prove there is one. But Arthur Kingsbury Masters, the baby from that upstairs room, grew up. He had brothers and sisters named Alex and Vera and Nita and Claude, and there is a photograph of the 5 of them together, and that photograph survives because a descendant of theirs went looking, found the researchers who study this family, and wrote to them. There are people alive today whose great-grandmother was the young woman in the corner of the Ingalls kitchen. I want you to hold that, because it changes how the rest of this has to be told. And there is one more Masters, and he is the one who makes the erasure hardest to explain. Samuel Masters, George's father, Laura's schoolteacher at Walnut Grove. He did not stay behind in Minnesota. He brought his family to Dakota Territory in 1881, the year after that winter, following the son who had gone out ahead of him. He filed his own homestead claim in October of 1883. He served as county surveyor of Kingsbury County. He ran for county school superintendent and lost. He lived in Smet for 12 years, and he died there in 1893. 12 years. In the same small town, the man who taught Laura Ingalls to read a schoolbook in Minnesota was walking the same 3 streets as her family for over a decade, holding county office, surveying the boundaries of the farms around them. He is not in any of the 8 books. Not under his own name, not as a minor character, not as a line. The teacher who appears in the Little House books is a composite and an invention. The real one is in the De Smet Cemetery. And one more, because we started with her and we should finish with her. Genevieve Masters, George's younger sister, the teacher's daughter, one of the 3 real girls that Laura melted together to make Nellie Oleson. She married a man named William Graham Van Renwick in De Smet on the 11th of September, 1888. He was later convicted of embezzlement and later pardoned, and the 2 of them moved to Chicago. She had one daughter, Margaret, and on the 7th of November 1909, Genevieve died of pneumonia. She was 42. They brought her back to De Smet and buried her there, which means that the most famous villain in American children's literature is lying in the same small prairie cemetery as the family she was written to torment, about 200 yards from Charles and Caroline Ingalls, and has been since 1909. 23 years before the first book was published. She never knew. None of them ever knew. Go and stand in that cemetery now, and you can see the whole of tonight laid out in about 400 yards of grass. Charles Ingalls, 1902. Caroline, 1924. Mary, 1928. Brought back 300 miles from Keystone. Grace, 1941. Carrie, 1946. Brought back from Rapid City. And a small stone for a baby son who died in 1889, which was not placed until 1958 by a memorial group, because nobody living could any longer say precisely where in that ground he was. And Genevieve Masters, 1909, from Chicago. The only one who is not there is Laura, who is 900 miles south in Missouri, in the town where she wrote all of it down. Which brings us, at last, to a desk in Missouri, 1937, Rocky Ridge Farm, near Mansfield. Laura Ingalls Wilder is 70 years old. She has published 5 books. She is working on the 6th, the one about that winter, and she is doing it largely in letters, back and forth with her daughter Rose, who is a professional writer and who is pressing her hard about structure. We have some of those letters, and what they show is a woman making deliberate decisions about who is allowed to be in a book. You already heard her on the boasts. There are more objections to moving them to town to live with us. Leaving them on the farm all winter shows the fear of the storms. That is craft. That is a novelist deciding where to stand people so the reader will feel the weather. And here is the same hand, in the same period, on George Masters. He never went with Pa for a load of hay. He never twisted any. He just sat. I have brought that sentence back 3 times tonight, and I want to be honest with you about why. Because it means something different now than it did an hour ago. The first time you heard it, it was a grievance. The second time, it was a grievance with a defense attached, because we had worked out what a 27-year-old man with no wages and no way home was actually carrying that winter. And now you know the rest. You know that he went to work in a lumber yard and stayed 12 years. You know that he raised 9 children. You know that in 1886 Charles Ingalls, who had been out in the sloughs cutting hay, while that same man sat by the fire, walked into a land office and put George Masters down as a witness that the farm was his. The 2 men settled it. Laura never did. 2 rationales come out of the record for why she cut them, and they do not contradict each other. The first is craft. Rather than complicate the story with people who were not family, she left them out. The scholar who edited her autobiography puts it that the power of that book depended on the family being alone against the weather. 6 is a family, 9 is a boarding house. The second is judgment. In Laura's account, George Masters had not earned a place in a survival story because he did not survive it. He was carried through it, and that judgment did not soften in 58 years, which is a very long time to keep something warm. But there is one more piece, and it is the piece I keep turning over, and it is why I wanted to tell you this story tonight, instead of a simpler one. Laura believed something about Maggie Masters that was not true. In a letter to Rose, she wrote that Maggie didn't want the baby to be born at her folks and disgrace them, and she wrote that George's folks were mad because he married her. That is the shape of a very specific accusation, and everybody in 1880 knew exactly how to read it. A girl in trouble, a hurried wedding, a family sending her away to have the baby, somewhere out of sight of neighbors who could count months. Now here are the 2 dates. George Masters and Margaret Gilmore married in July of 1879 at Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Arthur Kingsbury Masters was born on the 23rd of May, 1880. Count it, 10 months. There is no scandal in 10 months. There is nothing in 10 months at all. The arithmetic that the whole judgment rested on does not work, and it has not worked at any point in the last 140 years. Researchers who have gone through this family's papers have said it about as directly as researchers ever say anything. Laura may have believed that George and Maggie had a hurried wedding, and there is simply no evidence that they did. And they add something else, which I think is the right note to end the evidence on. Those people have living descendants. We should be careful about repeating a thing as fact when it was only ever one person's belief. So this is what actually happened. A girl of 13 went into a winter carrying a piece of gossip about the young woman sleeping on the other side of a wall. She came out of that winter and grew up and married and buried a baby son of her own and lost a house to fire and moved to Missouri in a wagon and farmed for 40 years and became famous at 65. And at 70, sitting at a desk in Missouri with 5 published books behind her, she was still carrying it, still certain, still writing it down to her daughter as though it were a known thing about a woman who had been dead for 33 years by then. We had not asked or wanted them to stay with us, she wrote, but they were out of money and had nowhere to go, so they just stayed on. That is not the sentence of a woman who has decided to be cruel. It is the sentence of a woman who has decided, finally, that the story is better without them, and who has a reason ready for why. Times like this test people, she wrote. And we were getting to know George and Maggie. I think that is the truest line anybody ever wrote about that winter, and I do not think she meant it the way I am about to take it, because every single person in that building got tested. Charles Ingalls, who had spent 19 years turning labor into paper and paper into nothing, and who went out for the hay anyway, every day, at 44, in a season with snow falling 4 days out of 5. Caroline, who fed 9 people out of a house built for 6, and never left a single note about what it cost her, and who 4 years earlier had buried a 9-month-old son on the road to Iowa. Mary, 15 and blind and 18 months into a darkness that was never going to lift, in rooms that had stopped being learnable. Laura, 13, keeping score, which is what you do at 13 when you are cold and frightened and there is nothing else you are allowed to do. And Maggie Masters, in somebody else's kitchen, with a baby she could not keep warm without another woman's fire, being quietly judged for a wedding date that was perfectly ordinary. They all passed, in the only sense that mattered out there. The Long Winter was published in 1940 and was a runner-up for the Newbery Medal the following year. Mary had been dead for 12 years by then. She never knew any of the books existed. She died in 1928, 4 years before the first one was printed. Grace died on the 10th of November 1941 of complications of diabetes at 64. She lived long enough to read the book about that winter. Carrie died on the 2nd of June 1946 of the same thing at 75. She saw all 8 of them published. And Almanzo Wilder died at Rocky Ridge on the 23rd of October 1949 at 92 of a heart attack, with only Laura in the house. His obituary said he had once saved his snowbound town from starving by driving 40 miles through a blizzard for wheat. 40 miles. It was about 6. By then the book had been out for 9 years, and the town had learned its own history from it, the way towns do. Here is what I keep coming back to. There is a photograph of that store building on the main street of Smet, taken while it still stood, false front, 2 stories, and upstairs, across the front, 2 windows. In the book, there is one. She was a careful woman. She argued with her daughter over commas and over facts, and over what a town was allowed to be told about itself. She remembered the exact conduct of a man beside a fire 6 decades after the fire went out, down to the detail that he never twisted any. She did not misplace a window. She took a family out of a room, and the room kept the evidence anyway, the way rooms do. The lamp gets carried to the last room now. There is a building on a Dakota street that is not there anymore. There is a boy who was 5 months old in October and a year old in May, and who grew up and had brothers and sisters and children of his own, and whose great-grandchildren went looking for him. There is a young woman who slept in a house where she was tolerated and not loved, and who was judged for 60 years over a date that was never wrong. And there is a man who sat by a fire, and then went and worked 12 years in a lumber yard, and then signed his name on his neighbor's land papers on the day it finally counted. None of them are in the book. All of them were in the house. 9 people went in when the sky closed in October, and 9 people came out when it opened in May, and the 2 women in that kitchen are the reason. You can let this one go now. It kept everyone who was in it. Good night.